Hello, everybody. I'm Liz Statlander, marriage and family therapist and mental health counselor. If you've never watched my show before or you've never visited my channel or my Facebook, welcome. It's nice to have you all here on this Monday afternoon at 3. And I decided to pick Monday as my new day for the show because I think Mondays sometimes are those days that we have a hard time getting through because we were off all over the weekend and we kind of settled down from the busyness of the week. And then Monday comes around and sometimes I hear a lot from my clients, and I know I felt this way too, like, oh my God, Monday, and we get that little sinking pit feeling in our stomach. So I thought Mondays at 3 would be a great time to talk to all of you and just help reset everything that's been going on today, Monday, and that will be coming up for the week so you can go into the rest of the week with a really open mind and, with hope that, this is a little grounding reset every Monday that you can reach for. So again, if this is your first time here, I have a history of doing podcasting. I used to do it really frequently and talking about different issues with mental health and relationships, and sometimes even talking about what's going on in the world. And as I took about a year or two off, I'm coming back once a week, and I want to focus on grief. And one, because it's my specialty. I'm a grief specialist. I've been training, working amongst grieving people, both children and adults, for most of my career, which is around 16 or 17 years. And it is something that is not mutually exclusive from loss. So sometimes when we think about grief, we think about it in this big sort of lump of a term that means the feeling we have when somebody we love dies. And while that's true, that is the feeling. Grief does refer to that. We also have other kinds of grief that kind of sneak into our lives through other kinds of loss that sometimes we're not aware of. We don't realize it's grief because it doesn't seem to fit in that category as someone dying. Maybe nobody died. Maybe you went through a divorce, or you're dealing with aging parents, or your children are leaving and they're all grown and leaving the house, or you're changing career, or you had some significant financial changes in your life. Any kind of change breaks up the idea of self-continuity, that we understand ourselves by sort of staying the same, and we don't stay the same. The one certain thing in life is change, whether that happens through somebody dying or whether it happens just because of something else, doesn't really matter. The feeling of loss is grief, and grief can actually be experienced and felt when we might not be connecting the dots and saying, oh, the way I feel is grief. So I'm going to get into a little bit about that today. So if this is something that you've been struggling with, we're going to talk about it today, and feel free to ask any questions, and I hope I can answer them by the end. And if you want to stay silent, that's okay too. This is just a gift to you guys, from my heart to you, so that you can use it to help yourself get through whatever you're going through and navigate loss. So I think a good way to start is talking about the different kinds of loss. So in the professional thanatology, which is, basically the study of grief and death and dying, there's a couple different kinds of grief. And a lot of times people don't know that. And when you have different kinds of grief, you might have different kinds of reactions, different symptoms going on. But I would say by and large, grief will present itself, whether it came through the loss of a loved one or a loss of a relationship, loss of, a continuity of self, a change in a job. Any kind of loss will usually present through anxiety and perhaps depression. You might find yourself really down in the dumps, or you just don't feel like you have any energy. Grief is kind of sneaky, and it can show itself in so many different ways. Another way I think that I should mention is your health. A lot of times when people are going through a major loss of whatever, we might start experiencing health issues out of the blue. And this has been studied, and it's something I've experienced myself. When we're going through a lot of change and a lot of loss, our body thinks it's under threat, and we may see it showing up as back pain, getting sick a lot, stomach aches, headaches, joint tightness. I mean, the list goes on. Losing hair. A lot of people lose their hair. Gaining weight, losing weight. So any kind of shift in that continuity of self, sort of like your baseline, what you're used to knowing about yourself and seeing in yourself, when those things start to change, you're going to see these kind of symptoms. And sometimes it's hard to pinpoint to grief specifically when indeed that might be what's happening. So if you're listening right now, or whenever you're listening, just take a minute and maybe jot down on a piece of paper or say it into your phone, what's changed in the last 6 months or a year of my life? Did I change jobs? Did I have a significant financial situation change, better, worse? Have I been sick a lot? Am I losing my independence? Have I lost my health? Have I changed relationships? Have I moved? Just write it down, and you might be surprised that there's little things popping up that you were kind of pushing away or overriding that are actually, it's grief. Grief can be complex because it will, we kind of understand it in my field. We understand it in a couple different ways. So we understand basic standard grief, which is, knowing that somebody is unwell, knowing that their health may be declining, and you sort of expect that they may die sooner than you'd like, but you don't really know for sure, but when you're sort of in that in-between. So for example, my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer out of the blue when she was 60, and she lasted until she was 68 years old. But all of those 8 years, there was a lot of anticipatory grief, which is another kind of grief, when you're not really sure what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty, but this person isn't well, and that they could die. And that's more standard grief or anticipatory grief. And then we have something called complex grief. And complex grief is basically when somebody dies suddenly, just out of the blue, a heart attack. I've heard everything from being a therapist. People going for surgery and they don't come back. Could have been a routine surgery. I mean, it's not common, but it can happen. Car accidents. I mean, I don't even want to get into some of the things I've heard, but there's a lot of different ways that people can die suddenly, and that is so different than standard grief. None of it's fun. It's all horrible, but complex grief, the sudden death of somebody or a really sudden loss of somebody, tends to be, we call it complicated because it's compounded with shock and sudden immediate changes that really are too much for any individual to really absorb at a time. So grief, especially in complex cases, that can be something that sort of unfolds over years and years of your time. So I'm not saying that necessarily you're going to be in intense grief for 5 or 6 years if somebody dies, although you might be, it's possible. But it kind of comes and goes. It comes in waves, and it comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes. So you might notice if you're grieving somebody or something, you might notice like 1 minute I'm okay and I'm laughing, and then the next minute I'm crying again. And this is very normal, a very normal response to grief. And when we lose somebody or something we love and we enjoyed, it is devastating. Make no mistake about it. And the last thing I want anyone listening to this or any of my clients, they know this, is never to be judging yourself for what you're going through, because grief is quiet. It's not always loud and hysterically crying. It can be very lonely, something that you really carry with yourself alone and maybe don't even share. Or it could be something that's so overwhelming that it might take you a couple years, and yes, a couple years to really even digest that it's happening. And a lot of people who have suffered grief will tell you, and it's been my experience as well, that I can look back on people I loved and lost, and it just seems surreal. So if you're feeling like it's been 2 years since your mom died, or since your husband died, or your wife, or whomever, whatever, and you still sometimes think about it like, oh my God, I can't even believe that this is real, you're not going crazy. This is absolutely normal parts of grief. Grief is complicated, and it's heavy, it's lonely, and it's private. And I've worked with grieving people most of my career, and I've been a grieving person a lot of my career. So I understand. And when you're grieving, what you really need is somebody who's not afraid to sit with you in your grief. Somebody who can sit with you, hold your hands, and just be with you while you're going through loss. And unfortunately, a lot of times when somebody dies, or if there's been a divorce, people will disappear. And I see this in almost every case. And my clients or my friends say, I don't understand. When my husband died, none of his friends talk to me anymore. Or, none of the couples that I used to go out with call me. And unfortunately, that happens because a lot of people are really uncomfortable talking about grief. I am not one of those people, but I've experienced friends, family, they just can't deal with it. So they just move on like nothing happens, or they run away or they stay away because they just can't, they don't want to be burdened with the heaviness. And partially, it's not your fault. Part of it is that because we don't speak about death and dying enough, and people, it's so taboo and people really don't like the topic, nobody gets educated and nobody really understands why people do what they do or where are they all going. So usually when you have one significant loss, many other losses tend to follow. Now, some people will move in closer as well, but it really pulls the rug out from underneath you. And if you've been through grief and loss, you know what I'm talking about. And theoretically, whether that loss happens through a divorce or it happens through a car accident is irrelevant, because at the bottom line, you're going to feel it. You're going to feel the impact, and nobody else is going to feel grief quite like you. Other family members may grieve, of course, and they may, talk about it once in a while, but grief is something I believe that people don't talk a lot about grief because it's one of those issues where we can't solve it, right? Most other medical issues, clinical issues, okay, we can say this is how we treat depression, or this is how we treat addiction, or this is how we deal with couples. But with death, nobody has answers, right? Nobody can really say for sure where your loved one is or what happens. Where are they? And even the greatest, mediums in the world and so on and so forth, they can't give you absolute certainty about where your loved one is or what happened to them. And that's scary. And I think that's why this topic is often underserved. So I'm hoping that to be talking about it and put myself out there and let people know that there's somewhere safe to land, hopefully that's helpful. And hopefully if you're not grieving or you've never lost a loved one, that's amazing. I'm glad you're watching, because this might be good information for you to know, for the future, or for a friend, right? Or for yourself going through changes. So if you've gone through an actual death of someone you loved, or you got divorced, or your children are leaving, or you had some major personal changes, some sort of loss of an identity, it feels just as awful. And I'm just driving home the point that we may not understand that grief is an emotion that you can have as a result of other things besides somebody dying. So I want to drive that point home. So before I go further into the grieving from death, I also want to talk about and set the stage for people who are grieving for other reasons. Like, what does that mean? Like, what do you mean, Liz? Like, what's another thing people could be grieving from? Well, that is a long list. It's a really long list. It can be something, like I said, divorce. A divorce is a death, make no mistake about it. It's the death of a relationship. It's the death of a life together. And it's also the end of an identity as a married person or as the role you played in your family or in the other person's family. And it can be very confusing because you don't know who the hell you are anymore, right? If I'm not playing these roles in somebody's life, or if I'm not taking care of somebody, right? Caretaker grief, okay? Who am I? What am I doing, right? So there's grief in those instances of divorce, losing a relationship, changing, moving cities, whatever you want to call it. All of it can be sneaking in, and you might say, well, gee, why am I feeling this like this? I mean, nobody died. I mean, I still talk to my ex and I know they're alive and well, but that doesn't mean that you're not grieving. You're just grieving as a result of something different than a death. Another way we grieve is grieving somebody who is alive. And that's been a major part of my practice as well throughout the years. People come because they lost a relationship with their children, or they lost their relationship with a sibling, and they're alive and they're well, but something happened and the other person has no interest in responding and being part of your life anymore. And that is terribly hurtful, right? So we can look at all the different ways that we could lose somebody. And no matter why we are losing someone or what the format is, it doesn't mean you can't grieve if the person's alive. And I think that confuses a lot of people. They'll come to therapy and my children aren't talking to me, or my my sister's not talking to me, my brother, whatever. And it's so hard because there's no finality. When somebody dies, on some level, we understand that it's finite. This person is, unfortunately, this person is no longer with us in the physical realm. But when it's grieving someone who's alive, it's very confusing because a lot of people will, try to solve that relationship and fix that relationship and make it better and try and get nowhere and get rejected over and over and over again. So in these circumstances, what's the difference whether they died physically and left the earthly realm or if they simply are no longer communicating with you? In some cases, that can be really complex. And so many, I could do a show on all of these things individually, but today I'm just kind of going to give you a deep dive into it so that you can understand how grief looks and the big capacity of it. So we don't start getting upset with ourselves for feeling sad or what we don't understand might be grieving when the person is still alive, right? And so that's a message that I'm being repetitive, but I want to drive it home. You can grieve somebody who is alive. You can even grieve somebody you live with. And anyone who's watched their marriage or their relationship fall apart knows exactly what I'm talking about. You know that relationship is over. You just don't want to step in and deal with it. And you still have this little flicker of hope that, okay, maybe I can do this differently or that differently, and maybe the relationship will come back. But in your heart, it's over. So you can grieve somebody who's sleeping in the bed with you. That's how big grief is. and how widespread it is through so many different circumstances, so many different relationship types. So what I feel gets in my profession and in society at large, I think we miss this. We totally miss this. Okay, if somebody died, I go to a grief counselor, or I go to someone who specializes in grief, or I go to therapy. But if I'm going through a divorce, or, my relationship's dying, or my kids won't talk to me, or my sister doesn't talk to me, we tend to take that, we don't think of it as grief. And we think of it as a relationship issue, which it is. Don't get me wrong. It's a relationship issue, but it's significant loss. So if these are any of the circumstances that you've ever been or find yourself in, you are, no question, you are probably grieving and just didn't recognize it. You didn't recognize it. So, okay. So we have this idea now we talked about what grief is and how it can show up and what it might look like. And I also want to kind of jump into what is grief, right? It's not, when we say depression, we understand. Depression, we think, okay, that's somebody who's sad, right? Or anxiety, that means somebody's nervous all the time. We have these quick references for understanding these terms. But grief, not so much, right? Because grief, when you're grieving, it's so huge because grief can show up in so many different ways. If someone asked me, what does a grieving person look like? Even though I've been doing this for 17 years, I would say I can't answer that, because you can look, and this is what I'm famous for, I can look like I'm doing fantastic on the outside. I can perform wellness, and I have traditionally done that, and been grieving inside. And I'm not the only one on the planet who does this. This is very common, especially in people who are caretakers. So what does a grieving person look like? Could look like anything. Could look like a perfectly grounded, healthy person. It could look like a very sick, sad, anxious person. It could look like somebody who is just not themselves. So if you have a friend or a family member, or if it's you, and you go, I'm just not feeling myself lately, or you're looking at other people that you love and there's been a significant loss or change in their lives, chances are, if they're feeling a little bit off, they're probably grieving. They may not even know it. So now you can have that information to know that maybe I should ask them how they're doing, or maybe I should, talk to them. And so many people are afraid of grieving people. I've been surprised in my practice to see when somebody dies, how many people do not show up for that grieving person, and in a good light, who does. It's oftentimes people you weren't expecting. So that layers grief and compounds it with more grief. And I feel like I sound really negative, but I'm being honest that grief has layers and it has complexity. And I've come to understand, I think the reason people are afraid to approach the grieving person is because we think, oh my God, this is so horrifying and this is so big, and I don't think I could handle this. I don't know what to say. And I want to encourage you, if you're one of those people, to take a step back, take a breath, and tell yourself a different story. You don't need to take it on. It's not your responsibility to take on someone's grief, but you can certainly sit with them, and you can certainly suggest talking to someone, and you can certainly have them share this video, for sure. At the very least, you can say, hey, I know you just lost your sister and I see a little change in your behavior and I saw this podcast, and send it their way. There's so many ways that we can reach out to people and just let them know that we care without carrying it, right? So a lot of us who fear talking to someone who's been through grief, don't be afraid. We're all still people, and we're all still human. And if you fall apart when you're talking to them and you're sharing compassion, then fall apart together. That's what friends are for, and that's what we're here to do. And so I want to encourage people who feel frightened by that not to be. Because when you miss somebody who's grieving and nobody shows up for them and nobody cares, it can lead into a lot of dysfunction for that person. So it's good to be educated and aware of what you can do without actually taking on their grief, right? And that's also another show. All these show topics are coming out of the conversation today, which I knew they would, because grief is such a big topic. It's such a big topic. So just kind of reviewing what we've been talking about. And if anyone has questions, feel free to ask. I will answer them as soon as I can. We're talking about this big umbrella word called grief, right? This big word. And we're talking about complex grief. And you don't have to remember any of this, but complex grief, standard grief, anticipatory grief, right? Grieving someone who's alive and not someone necessarily who's just died. So today we are understanding through this podcast, we're understanding that grief is not necessarily just for people who lost a loved one. It's also for people who might have lost someone who's living. Again, their children, their siblings. It could be a lifestyle. It could be safety. It could be security. So grief shows up in so many different ways in our lives, and there's no shame in any of it. So if you're sad because, you moved from San Diego to LA, you're allowed to grieve. You're allowed to be homesick, and you're allowed to be sad. And I think when we have the courage to face our grief instead of run away from it, we have better chances of getting through it with less dysfunction, because grief will knock you on your ass. It will knock you on your ass. It will take the strongest of us people and it will knock us on our ass, and sometimes we're not even aware of it. Okay, so we have this broad umbrella word grief and the different ways it can show up. And then we also have an understanding, hopefully now, of understanding what it might look like when someone's grieving. And what I said earlier is, who knows? It can look as grounded and as alive as I am right now in this moment with a smile. You wouldn't know. Or it could be someone who looks completely disheveled, distraught, and crying, right? Because everybody expresses grief in different ways. So we may assume somebody's okay when they're really not. So if you have an inkling, or you know that someone's lost somebody or had a loss of a relationship or whatever, don't be afraid to step up and show you care, right? And that if you're afraid that you might not say the right thing, or you don't know what to say to the person, better to say something than nothing, right? You can send a simple text and say, hey, I know you went through a lot of grief this year, a lot of change, and I just want you to know, if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. Or, hey, I just watched this podcast on grief, I'm going to send it your way. Because any of that will let the grieving person know that you care. And that's really important when you're grieving, you feel very, very alone. And nobody can grieve for you. They can grieve with you, but they may not grieve the same way that you do. Right? So you just never know. And I've seen, even in the spectrum of families, maybe the father's handling it one way, the mother's handling it another way, the kids are handling it another way. It's just hard to tell. So I can't say for sure, but I think a grieving person in their inner world may isolate a little bit, may feel tired often, may lose interest in doing things that they normally do, possibly. Or sometimes you'll see the opposite. You'll see somebody constantly running around after somebody died to kind of like a grasshopper just keep moving and moving and moving in order to feel okay. And there's no time limit on grief, no matter which way it came to you, no matter what package it came in. There's no time limit. That was a big issue in my field in the diagnostic manual because our diagnostic manual used to say, if you're still grieving after 2 years, then basically there was something wrong. I forget the name. It was bereavement with something, I don't know, difficulty or whatever. And that got a lot of us therapists upset because we know that grief doesn't have a timeline. It doesn't have any specifics. And I think that's why people don't want to tackle the topic, because there's no clear-cut answer. So again, if you are grieving or you're friends with someone who's grieving or a family member, you don't need to solve the grief for them. You just have to let them know, and I think this is very important, that if they need someone to hold their hand through it, that you'll do it. And that is so meaningful to a grieving person because, again, grief is a lonely place to be. It's a very lonely place to be. And I find with my clients who come to me through grief, which a good number of my clients have, some of them have and don't even know it. You know, they might have come to me because they were, thinking about getting out of their marriage, or think about changing careers, or coming to me to get rid of, to work on addiction. And guess what, guys? Guess what's behind all that? The big G. It's behind it all. Addiction, depression, anxiety, all of it. Grief is always a factor, and it's missed. It's missed so much. So I hope this will wake people up that it's a powerful emotion, right? If I had to define grief, I think somebody asked me this earlier. I don't even know how I would do it. I would say grief is grief is the package of emotions experienced intensely after the loss of a loved one. Period. Notice I didn't say death, right? Loss of a loved one. And it's intense, and it's complex, and it's multifaceted, right? So if we are grieving, some people who are grieving, they've come to I think I'm losing my mind. I can't concentrate. I can't keep things straight. I forget. And I say, you know what? That's normal. I remember when my mother passed away, I would repeat myself to my friends on the phone and not realize I was doing it. Within minutes, 20 minutes, I would hang up and then call them back. And Liz, you just told me this. And I would not remember, because your mind is it's just spinning, right? Because you're thinking about just the heaviness of how will I get through this life without this person? And then all the things you have to then take care of when somebody dies. The finances, the kids, the homes, the jobs, the work. We expect people after grief to just be able to jump back into life, which is ridiculous because you just can't. And that becomes, again, another layer of what makes grief so heavy. So grief is a package of a wide spectrum of emotions felt after the loss of a loved one. It's big, right? It's big. And it sneaks up on us sometimes. We might have a good couple of months and be busy and think, hey, I'm really moving on here. Okay, this is good. And then you might hear a song in the car or pass something on the road that reminds you of the person, and boom, you're back there. So when I was training, when I worked for the Children's Bereavement Center, which was my first mental health job, the thanatologist who trained me explains, grief is like a wave. It comes in and it comes out. And there was a very clear rule for us that if we were, we were never allowed to say to somebody, move on. Never. Because that is so dismissive and so erasing of somebody's humanity, right? Because we don't know. And during a lot of the significant losses that I've had in my life, most of them, thank God, were during a time where I worked for myself. But most corporations, they don't give you much time, and it has to be an immediate relative. It's like 3 days for bereavements. And, in my private practice, I had to go through the loss of a lot of things and keep showing up for my clients. So we don't treat it, I don't think we treat it the right way in this country. I think we kind of, by not allowing people to take days off for bereavement or grief, we tend to just dismiss it like it's not that big of a deal, right? And then when you've been in grief and you've lost somebody you love, and you're thinking, how am I going to get off this couch? How am I going to, pay a bill? Or how am I going to deal with my children? And then you're expected to just jump back into work like, nothing ever happened. So we don't support grieving people enough, I don't think. So I hope that this is helpful. And I think that we have to learn. I think if we understand that the only thing that we have to do is just show up for ourselves, and that's it, it takes a lot of the pressure off. So if you're a grieving person, again, from which way grief may have hit you, just show up. That's it. You don't have to perform. You don't have to hide your emotions. You don't have to pretend like everything is okay. You can show up for yourself. And that's it. And it's a day by day situation. And if you love somebody who's grieving, be patient with them. Understand that for a little while, they might not be themselves, and understand that it might take a couple years for them to really start re-engaging in life. I've worked with some parents who have lost children, and individually, they've all told me that it was 5 years before they could really function again. That doesn't mean they didn't work, doesn't mean they were sitting at home crying for 5 years every day, but they were so bereft and so numb and so emotionally scattered that they said it was a good 5 years. And I've seen it in real time. A lot of the clients that came to me for a significant loss are still with me many years later, because you need support, and you need good support, right? You need a therapist who understands it, who has experience with it, who can really help sit with you and not run away from you like a lot of people do when you're grieving. A lot of people. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else for me to make sure I get in here. I think we did this is like grief 101, okay? And understanding how it may look for you, for someone you love, how it may show up, how it can be in the backgrounds of your life, or any issues you may be having with anxiety or depression or fatigue or health problems. Sit back and think about it. And, one of the things I do a lot of times with newer clients is I'll say, okay, make a list for me of, the 5 most significant things that have happened to you in the past year. And I'm always surprised to find out, because they don't realize it, that typically they had compounded grief. They had, maybe a sick spouse who eventually passed away, a child that moved away, a job change, a financial change, and then let's not forget about the identity change that happens to a person after grief. So without realizing it until she put it on paper, I don't know why I'm so upset. Well, look at what you've been through. Look at all the loss you've had around different aspects of your life. And I think that's probably the one thing I want to get in before I finish is talking about the identity loss. So when we are, used to doing something repeatedly, or used to waking up with somebody, used to having them around all the time, or having this job, this thing, whatever, around all the time, and you lose it, then we go back to this loss of identity, and we need to reconstruct that. So, after and while you're digesting your grief, then the other question becomes, who am I without this person? And this is more, I would say, of a part 2 of grief, but it's a place where a lot of people get tripped up, and they think, well, okay, this person died, I adjusted, I'm moving on, I'm rolling with the punches, I'm going with the flow. But inside, in the inner world, is where they feel this lack of fulfillment. And that's often because we have to become somebody totally different. Not totally, but we have to become somebody different after somebody dies, right? Because number one, you're never quite the same after you've been through that kind of trauma. So that in itself is one branch of the identity. And then, how do I go on without this person? And that's especially hard for spouses, caretakers. How do I go on without this person in my life? I mean, it seems inconceivable. So when I say that grief is deep and contextual and layered, it is. And I'm here to help people through it. I'm not afraid of it. I've studied it, I've lived it, and I've counseled people through it. And I get people pretty raw. A lot of times I get people a couple days, a week out of a loss. And at that point, you're just trying to stabilize people. It takes a while. And so, final message. If you are grieving and you feel that this podcast resonated with you, or if you thought of someone specific in talking about loss, maybe it's a brother or sister, or a parent, or a spouse, a partner, a boss, whatever, give yourself a break. You're allowed to grieve. You're allowed to be sad. You're allowed to experience these emotions, and you're allowed to ask for help. So, but if you don't ask for help, people may not see you. They may not see you drowning. So don't be afraid to ask for help. And remember that the only job you have is to show up for yourself. And I mean, just show up. Just wake up and just be. And the intensity of the pain does dissipate over the years. It takes a little bit of time. And I don't mean to scare people into thinking that if you're in intense grief that you're going to feel like this forever, because you won't. You will not. But you want to reach out and get help. It's important for your future trajectory and how the grief event will shape you and unfold you for the years going forward. And we want you to be as fulfilled and as content as possible. If you're looking to work with somebody, if you're looking for a grief counselor, I do grief counseling. Really at this point, I do mostly intensive containers. So basically, I do a month program, maybe 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the situation. And we meet several times a week for a month or two. And then after that, we do maintenance, which could be different for different people. It could be once a week, it could be every 2 weeks, it could be once a month, but we kind of gradually do maintenance. And I can tell you, from the bottom of my soul, having a good therapist when you're grieving is a game changer. It's a game changer because you're not alone in your grief. And being alone in your grief it's a dark place. It's a dark place. So make sure you reach out, okay? And I wish you a beautiful week. And I hope that you can just take this time to listen. Maybe you'll re-listen to it another time. Maybe you'll share it with a friend. But don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask for resources. And don't be afraid to ask for advice. And there is hope. You will laugh and smile again. I promise you, you will. You will. And until next week, I will see you next Monday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Take care, everybody, and have a great day.